Let me put it like this. It's not every day the Speaker of the House privately meets with the majority of the members of the House to debate impeaching the president. But that is how Speaker Pelosi began her day today, a response to what began as private and then was increasingly public lobbying by at least some Democrats for an impeachment probe, saying that's the best way to confront increasing White House stonewalling. Now, today, some Democrats clashed with Pelosi. Sources tell NBC News that while the Speaker reportedly used the time largely to let her members make their case, her office also released these principles: follow the facts, no one's above the law, and the one that apparently upset the president, accusing him of the most significant cover-up in modern history. Now, what was the debate in the room like? We don't know. It was obviously off the record, but there are clues leaking out. One member saying that having an impeachment inquiry doesn't change a darn thing. Pelosi responding, nothing. Another member reportedly openly talking politics, speculating that if they do impeach, that would make it harder, not easier, to beat the president. Now, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee serves on the Judiciary Committee, and today she launched this resolution, which we have here, brand new, authorizing the Judiciary Committee to investigate whether sufficient grounds exist for the House of Representatives to exercise impeachment power. Congresswoman, thank you for joining me on a busy evening. What does this mean, and how is it different from a formal impeachment probe?
Larry, first of all, let me say that it is extremely healthy that people who represent the people of the United States of America engage in a very important debate and discussion on the question of the rule of law and the Constitution. I dug deep into the House rules, the manual of practice, and certain provisions allow certain types of resolution. This is a resolution of investigation, which the language says that the House instructs the Judiciary Committee to investigate, to determine if it should utilize its powers of Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5. So it triggers, it's a two-step, which I think brings all thought processes together. But the importance of it is this: it gives the imprimatur of the seriousness of the purpose. It has the House vote on the question of investigation. And since 1900, the Congress has entrusted the Judiciary Committee to do its investigations. This does not preclude any other committee from continuing its investigation. And further, the successes that we recently had in the court decisions, of which we know the president's going to appeal, it gives greater strength now in parallel to the court decisions. The individuals receiving the subpoenas and the calls to testify know that the House of Representatives has directed the Judiciary Committee to do this work.
So this is less than a full impeachment probe, although, as you say, it could lead to or trigger that. Did you run this by the Speaker in advance? Did you get her blessing?
The good news is that the Speaker respects all members, and we used a deliberative process. Certainly, we have provided her with the information about the resolution. That is both protocol and respect, and I respect the Speaker and I respect leadership. And so we provided them with that information. I respect that, and I respect what you're saying. I guess what I'm asking respectfully is, can you tell us, is this something where you and the Speaker are in sync? I want to give you a chance to respond to some of the reaction to this, which is some people saying, oh, is this Speaker Pelosi's way to offer something less than the full impeachment probe, which, as you know, was at issue this morning? We're not in sync, and it is not something less than. It is just a two-step, and it does not preclude someone's inspiration on their own viewpoint. But I think that it speaks to the enormity of this House and Congress. We don't know whether there's any Republican member that would join the idea of an investigation. No, we have not coordinated this. She has only received information out of respect. We have not had any coordination because I think that she respects members' deliberative thought to come up with ideas that would work. This will work. This is a resolution of investigation.
Let me run something else by you, because as mentioned, you're on this very pivotal committee right now. This was a colleague of yours estimating how many of you and your members are for an impeachment probe in our discussion last night. Take a look.
The Judiciary Committee as a whole is for at least an inquiry of impeachment. I'd say 80–90% of the committee's on board to go forward.
Is that right?
That's probably true. And the resolution of investigation does not negate that, but it provides a two-step process so that if this was to go to the floor, there would be members who have different political perspectives than I would have, who would be willing to say, you're right. A resolution of investigation with the strength of the House of Representatives, both voting for it and directing the Judiciary Committee, I can support that. And then we make the determination, but which will ultimately, as you well know, articles of impeachment are the prerogative of the House floor to vote on.
Sure.
We act as a sitting indictment committee, meaning the Judiciary Committee. But the language of the resolution begins by saying it instructs the Judiciary Committee to investigate by way of the House of Representatives to determine if we are to utilize our powers of Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5. That is, of course, the constitutional powers.
I want to get you on one other thing. So we just did the Constitution. I'm just curious, as a member of the Congress, what was your view of the way the president acted and treated your Speaker Pelosi in that putative infrastructure meeting that wasn't today?
Historic moment that I've never seen in the last 5 decades, if you read your history books, let's put it that way. Certainly have not seen in the last 2 presidencies. It is unacceptable because all of us are in rooms with people that we vigorously disagree with, but we continue the discussion, and infrastructure is a lifeline of America, both in terms of the energy of the economy. As you well know, Ari, Ford has laid off 7,000 persons, some people who are just shy of retirement. An infrastructure bill might put an infusion of energy into the economy and help save jobs. But you don't mix apples and oranges. The investigation is one, and I'm sure Speaker Pelosi would be willing to discuss with him the investigation, her position on that investigation should go forward, and he could offer his perspective. But that kind of behavior and that kind of disrespect, if you will, to an equal branch of government, or maybe one that's more equal. Article 1, our Congress, which has the task of representing the American people, no matter who they are, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and then on the other hand, the executive, who we should acknowledge and respect, but that has to be a two-way street. And I'm saddened by what happened today, because we are doing what the Mueller report provided. Volume 1 and Volume 2. Volume 2 said, I have 9 matters that may be obstruction. I am leaving it to the Congress. We have no other task and no other way but to proceed with the investigation, and I encourage members to look at the resolution of investigation because it does provide the opportunity to investigate and to move to the next step.
I wanted to get you on that as well. Congresswoman Jackson, thank you so much. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.